This episode does have content that some may find distressing. Listener discretion is advised.
Hello and welcome to It's Murder Up North, and this the continuation in the Railway Killer arc. For over a decade, John Duffy had been behind bars, convicted of 3 rapes and 2 murders. Yet by 1998, he had revealed he hadn't acted alone, naming his accomplice as David Mulcahy. Join me as the second offender is unmasked. February 1999, David Mulcahy was arrested, and as he was led to the police car, he confidently asked the officers if he could call his wife to tell her what time to pick him up from the police station. Perhaps his confidence was born from a feeling that history was repeating itself, as in November 1986 he had faced this same scenario, one which he had gotten out of by claiming he and John Duffy were no longer close friends, while also providing plausible alibis for the relevant dates. However, since Duffy's arrest and incarceration, it had been suspected that Mulcahy was the second man involved in the spate of rapes that had taken place in London in the early to mid-80s. Detectives knew his claim that he and Duffy were estranged was false, due to the testimonies of other witnesses, including friends, family, and Duffy's ex-wife, who stated that the pair were virtually inseparable. They had also found a crack in Mulcahy's alibi for the evening of Alison Day's murder, with a signed statement from his GP indicating that, contrary to the claims that he had been bedridden with bronchial pneumonia on the 29th of December 1985, Mulcahy had been signed fit to return to work 6 days earlier. Furthermore, a search of his home and vehicles uncovered some potentially incriminating evidence. In his van, they recovered masking tape and a balaclava, yet this vehicle was used for his work as a painter and plasterer, and this was seen as a plausible explanation for their presence. During questioning, Mulcahy would deny being involved in the rapes and murders, with the married father of 4 explaining to the officers, "I don't need to rape women, I've got a nice wife at home, I get all the sex I can handle, plus sex and violence to me don't mix." An additional blow came when none of the rape victims were able to pick Mulcahy out during a lineup, and while another parade was held 4 months later, during which a student attacked in July 1983 was able to provide a positive identification, the evidence related to that incident wasn't sufficient to press charges. Ultimately, despite detectives' strong suspicions that Mulcahy was their man, the evidence simply wasn't there to connect him to the crimes. And while Duffy was brought to justice, his companion, who denied their friendship, continued to enjoy his freedom. Yet Mulcahy made his feelings regarding his arrest in 1986 perfectly clear, via a Daily Mail article published on the 27th of February 1988, the day after Duffy was sentenced. The headline read, "Police thought I was a rapist too. Duffy's best friend tells of ordeal as second man." The article, accompanied by a photo of Mulcahy hugging his wife Sandra, featured the man bemoaning that, quote, "The last 16 months have been a nightmare for me and my family. I just want to clear my name." Speaking of the turmoil he had been through, he claimed he had been wrongfully arrested and his life and reputation had been ruined, for which he planned to take legal action against the police. Mulcahy detailed that when he was brought in for questioning, the stress had contributed to his wife losing their 4th child, and that the scrutiny surrounding the potential involvement had caused him to lose friends and his job at Westminster Council. This last claim has been called into question, with it being suggested he had been let go as he was not completing jobs and his attendance was deemed unacceptable. Mulcahy would also disclose his thoughts on Duffy's conviction, stating that he couldn't imagine his friend committing such crimes because, quote, He has always been a mummy's boy. He's a born coward. It was a wonderful way to describe a man with whom he had once been virtually inseparable since they met on their first day at Chalk Farm Secondary School. Both were from Irish immigrant families, and while Duffy was born in Ireland, Mulcahy had been born in London on the 23rd of May 1959. Very little is known about his childhood, save that his father once worked as a mechanic until he and his wife began running pubs together. When Duffy and Mulcahy met at school, they developed an instant connection, forged from the bullying they endured, with Mulcahy taking on the role of protector for his shorter companion. It was a friendship Duffy would speak about to police in 1998, recalling, "We did everything together. We were in the same classes, we played truant together. If he got up to mischief, I was always there, and vice versa." While the pair were subjected to bullying at school, Duffy disclosed that they also harassed fellow students, especially girls in the playground. The boys took the harmless childhood game of chase and turned it into a more nefarious endeavour, with a girl being caught and their breasts grabbed by the pair. At 13 years old, Duffy would bear witness to an early sign of Mulcahy's vicious nature, when the pair were caught in the school playground, laughing as a badly beaten hedgehog lay on the ground before them, with Mulcahy wielding a cricket bat. The violent attack on the defenceless creature resulted in Mulcahy being suspended, but this was just the beginning of his thirst for violent pursuits, with Duffy claiming that his friend had ambitions of them both being warriors. In pursuit of this goal, the pair joined the Army Cadets and took martial arts classes. They also began stalking Hampstead Heath, wearing masks to sneak up on primarily gay couples and frighten them. By the age of 18, Mulcahy had been training as a plasterer, but he and Duffy had already been in trouble with the law. On the 22nd of August 1986, at around 3 p.m. in Earl's Court, 5 people were wounded by airgun pellets. 4 of them required hospital treatment. The shots had been fired from an upstairs window at the Prince of Teck pub, of which Mulcahy's parents were the landlords. It wasn't long before Duffy and Mulcahy were identified as the culprits, and on the 13th of December 1976, they were convicted of causing actual bodily harm. However, this incident did not curb their criminal activities, as they had also started committing petty thefts and joyriding in stolen cars. Not all their activities were reprehensible, as they were both learning a trade, Duffy pursuing carpentry while Mulcahy was training to be a plasterer and decorator. Aside from their studies, they would go on nights out to various pubs and clubs in the capital, and in June 1977, while at the Empire Ballroom in Leicester Square, Mulcahy met 16-year-old Sandra Carr. Just 2 days later, Duffy and Mulcahy would take Sandra and a friend to the coast, a memorable occasion which she later recounted to the Daily Mail in 2001, with her describing Mulcahy as being, quote, "a prankster who made me laugh." She, however, claimed she disliked his companion Duffy, who she perceived as being sly, and perhaps this dislike was partially why Duffy did not attend his best friend's wedding at Euston Registry Office in June 1978. Sandra was unaware that her husband and his best friend had already planned yet failed in an attempt to carry out an attack on a woman in her own home. Sandra did, however, learn of Mulcahy's conviction for car theft and gave him an ultimatum that she would leave him if he broke the law again. Her resolve was tested when in 1981, Mulcahy and Duffy were arrested for stealing alcoholic beverages from a storeroom, but she decided to stand by the man she loved, a man who just a year later would commit the first of a series of rapes. Sandra remained unaware of Mulcahy's nocturnal activities, only seeing him as a loving husband who worked hard to provide for her and their children. A man who, after losing his job following his arrest in 1986, would look after the children while she worked nights as a carer, and he would go on to establish his own decorating business. In 1989, despite all the scrutiny and accusations Mulcahy had faced regarding his possible involvement in Duffy's crimes, Sandra had stood loyally by him. She had also been his support upon the deaths of his parents, but Mulcahy would jeopardise their relationship by being unfaithful. It was a betrayal Sandra would later defend during the 2001 Daily Mail interview, in which she stated she'd forgiven him because the other woman had, quote, threw herself at him, but David told me it was only canoodling. But a year after this infidelity in 1990, Mulcahy was found guilty of assault and causing actual bodily harm after beating his 9-year-old son with a stick. For this offence, Mulcahy received a non-custodial sentence and a fine. His son was taken into foster care where he would remain for 2 years. Meanwhile, his siblings were placed on the at-risk register. This incident indicates a different side to the family man described by many of his neighbours and friends. And although this has never been confirmed, it suggests that perhaps the facade of a happy home life disguised a darker truth. While we do not know what occurred within the family home, by 1997 they were a household in mourning when one of the children passed away from leukemia. Meanwhile, Duffy, who had not heard from his former friend in a decade, had started to talk about his crimes, and his accomplice, David Mulcahy, a man who, upon his arrest in 1999, was certain he would be home within 24 hours. His police interviews followed the same pattern they had in 1986. No comments and denials delivered with an arrogance which suggested he assumed the police had nothing to connect him to the crimes Duffy had accused him of. His demeanour changed, however, when he was informed that a DNA profile had been recovered from the clothing of one of the Danish au pairs, who had been attacked by 2 men on Hampstead Heath in July 1984, adding that the tests had revealed it was a match to him. Hearing this, Mulcahy grew pale, and he grabbed a nearby waste bin in which to vomit. While the DNA and Mulcahy's reaction to its discovery were compelling, further evidence would be found at his home, which only strengthened the case against him. The first item was a grey zip-up hoodie, which had been described by the victims of 2 separate attacks, one on Barnes Common in January 1984 and another at Highgate, West Hill, later that year. Mulcahy would be charged with a series of rapes, but given the details provided by Duffy, police hoped to prove Mulcahy's connection to further offences. The search of his home revealed a multitude of weaponry, as well as photographs of Mulcahy taken during the 1980s, which showed he had a remarkable resemblance to some of the witness descriptions from the time. Among these photos was another image, which featured a young boy, identified as Mulcahy's nephew, fully clothed. His wrists and ankles were bound while sitting in a bathtub full of water. This startling image was explained by Mulcahy as the depiction of a harmless prank. But according to Duffy, Mulcahy was more than capable of committing some heinous crimes, and detectives went to great lengths to ensure the credibility of his statements. This included finding corroborating evidence. They would also escort Duffy to the various crime scenes, some of which he hadn't been to in over 10 years. Yet to the officer's amazement, he had an astonishing recollection of events. On Hampstead Heath, he took them to the exact bench on which one victim had been assaulted. Meanwhile, when taken to the location of Alison Day's murder, his recollections seemed less accurate. Duffy insisted there had been a path running beneath a bridge, yet in 1999 there was no such access. However, upon reviewing images from the 1980s, it was confirmed that a path had once passed underneath the bridge, as Duffy had claimed. Police had gone to all this effort in order to counter any claims against Duffy's credibility, particularly because Mulcahy remained adamant that his former friend was lying. Yet another aspect which strengthened Duffy's testimony was his willingness to implicate himself in the crimes. With him pleading guilty on the 24th of March 1999 to 9 counts of rape, 6 counts of conspiracy to rape, and 2 burglaries with intent to rape. Alongside these charges, Duffy also admitted his guilt in relation to the rape of Anne Locke, whose murder he alleged was committed by David Mulcahy, a man he claimed had also committed several rapes and murdered Alison Day and Martia Tamboza. However, many would question what had prompted Duffy's confession. Had the passage of time unravelled the once close bond? Mulcahy had made no effort to contact his friend since he was imprisoned, and as the years passed, the control he exerted over Duffy lightly lessened, allowing the former accomplice to view his circumstances with fresh eyes. Perhaps this new perspective caused him to question why Mulcahy should be free, while he was being punished for their crimes. Or maybe, as Dr. Cutler, the psychiatrist who had been treating Duffy in Whitemoor Prison, believed, the death of his beloved grandmother and estrangement from his mother had likely made him question where his loyalties lay. Having admitted his own wrongdoings, the British legal system would experience an unprecedented occurrence. Duffy, a Category A prisoner, would take to the stand at the Old Bailey to testify against his former accomplice, revealing what had occurred during the series of rapes and trio of murders, during a trial which would last for 5 months. On the 3rd of October 2000, David Mulcahy would stand in court number 1 at the Old Bailey, in the very dock that Duffy had stood in 12 years earlier, and after entering a plea of not guilty to each charge against him, he would be seated as the prosecution began their case, although it was noted that throughout the proceedings, Mulcahy was taking notes. Mr. Mark Dennis opened for the prosecution by describing the friendship that had once existed between the two men, one forged in the playground that had become, quote, a unique and wicked bond. A friendship which had been severed by Duffy's incarceration. Mr. Dennis denied that Duffy's confession had been motivated by a desire for revenge, nor had he been offered any incentive in exchange for his testimony, a claim which was reinforced by a letter from the Home Secretary stating that Duffy's whole life tariff would not change. Having established the credibility of their key witness, Mr. Dennis proceeded to outline the charges placed against Mulcahy, using a map of London to illustrate where each attack had occurred, and then he called their first witness. She was identified as the first known victim of the two men, having been attacked by the pair while walking along Burton Road in Kilburn in October 1982. The woman told the court she had a knife placed to her throat and was ordered to go with them. However, when they saw a vehicle approaching, she was flung over a 4-foot-high wall, resulting in her landing on a pile of rubble in the grounds of a partially built house. The two men jumped over the wall after her, and after placing a plaster over her mouth, she was assaulted by them both. When they finished, they fled, but before she could get her bearings, the shorter of the two men, likely Duffy, returned and pulled her back over the wall. Without saying a word, he disappeared once more. She described how she was able to return to the site the next morning, perhaps as a means of confirming that it had really happened, proof of which she found in the form of her handbag and a teddy bear which she had been carrying, that were lying on the floor where the attack had taken place. After that initial return, the woman told the court she struggled for several weeks to go near the site, but she did manage to go back one night just to prove that she could do it. Speaking of the effects the attack had on her, she stated that she had burned her clothes from that night because she felt so repulsed. She had also developed a visceral reaction to anything being near her neck, as these things reminded her of the blade against her throat. As such, she could no longer wear necklaces or other items in that area. The next woman to take to the stand described how her attack had changed the trajectory of her life. Once an ambitious legal secretary, hoping to pursue a career in law, she found she was unable to return to the job she once loved, unable to tell her employer what happened. It was a secret she had kept close to her chest, not even disclosing it to her husband until she had agreed to testify in court. Taking the stand, she disclosed she had been working overtime at the law firm one Sunday in March 1985, when at around 7 p.m. she was walking down a steep footpath on North End Way, listening to her Walkman. This was likely the one Duffy had given his wife, Margaret. As she descended the path, the woman was grabbed from behind and forced onto Hampstead Heath, where the taller of her two attackers, David Mulcahy, forced her to remove her clothing, but she recalled that he struggled to reach arousal, which he resolved by making her perform oral sex on him. The second man then assaulted her on a nearby bench, possibly the one Duffy would take the police to in 1999. After the two men fled, she found the nearest phone box and called her flatmate, who in turn called the police. When the officers arrived, she took them back to the scene of the attack, where her bag was lying on the ground, but her library card had been taken. The thought that these two men were now in possession of an item which disclosed her address terrified the woman. She remained in a constant state of fear that one day they would turn up at her home. Their testimonies were joined by other women who took to the stand to recount the event that changed their lives. One such witness had been attacked on Barnes Common, and following this she moved to the United States, where she married and had children, keeping her past trauma concealed. However, her daughter had long suspected her mother was holding on to something, and when the time came for her to testify against Mulcahy, the secret was disclosed. And as so many of her counterparts found, instead of driving her loved ones away, discussing what happened only strengthened her relationships. When she took to the stand, she spoke with determination and didn't falter under cross-examination, although it was clear she was under strain by the white knuckles on her hand that clung tightly to the rails as she testified. Afterwards she was escorted from the court, where all her fears and emotions that she had held over a decade were unleashed. After a tearful 10 minutes, she turned to the officer beside her and expressed her relief that she had gone through with it. The two Danish au pairs, whose clothing had held the vital evidence to ensnare Mulcahy, also took to the stand, while others who could not face the strain of being in the courtroom still wanted their voices to be heard, such as the German au pair, who provided a written testimony which was read aloud in court. She recalled her attack in Brent Cross, which occurred in January 1985, just 2 months after she had arrived in the UK. Her statement divulged that she had been making her way home from a disco when she was accosted, and despite trying to fend off her attackers with an umbrella, the two men overpowered her. They then took her beneath a bridge where a small stream ran, and tied her scarf over her eyes. She disclosed that after being assaulted, the tallest of the pair asked for her name and address, and warned her that if she told anyone what happened, he would find her. Through each testimony it became clear that Mulcahy had been the more dominant and violent of the pair. The accounts of these witnesses suggested that Mulcahy caused a deep-rooted fear within them. Some of them admitted to the court that they had actually recognised him in the lineups in 1986, but were just too afraid to pick him out in case he came after them. What one has to bear in mind is that these identity parades had been carried out with the witness in the same room as the potential suspects, which would have been a terrifying ordeal in itself, but the threats that this man had made against them would have made it even more horrific. Those who took to the stand weren't only being asked to relive their attacks, but they were also confronted by a hostile defence. During cross-examination by Mr. George Carter Stevenson, it was implied that they were lying in order to support the police, whom Mulcahy claimed had a vendetta against him. Despite this, the women remained steadfast on the stand. Their stories remained consistent and were delivered with certainty. Having heard from the victims of the attacks, the courtroom was to become privy to a rare moment in legal history, as one of the perpetrators took to the witness box to give a frightening insight into the minds of the two men who had terrified London for half a decade. Introducing Duffy to the stand, the prosecutor, Mr. Dennis, informed the jury it would be the most chilling evidence you are likely to hear, but also the most compelling. As the ginger-haired man took to the stand, he started by addressing the claims that he was shifting the blame, an accusation he denied by stating, "There is a lot of self-hate for what I have done. I feel a lot of guilt. I raped and killed innocent young ladies. I accept that. I am not trying to shift the blame. I did what I did." He concluded by stating he expected to die in prison. He proceeded to describe the bond that had developed between himself and Mulcahy. Starting in the schoolyard, they became intrinsically linked. He would indicate that being around Mulcahy was exciting, but as their crimes evolved, from petty thefts and joyriding to attacks on women and girls, Duffy claimed that his companion began to enjoy the godlike feeling the assaults gave him. Meanwhile, Duffy alleged that he was motivated by the anger and disappointment he felt regarding his marriage, implying that his victims were a surrogate for his wife. Duffy disclosed that with each attack, quote, "We would get excited by talking about what we did to the victims, and we got bolder as we progressed." He would detail each of their crimes, noting that their initial attempts had been unsuccessful, starting with a planned assault on a woman Mulcahy had been working for. She lived on Talbot Crescent in Hendon, and while working at the property, Mulcahy developed such a disdain for her that he felt she needed to be taught a lesson. Therefore, they planned to break into her home and attack her. Yet twice they gained entry to her property, but she didn't arrive home. The next attempt was on another woman Mulcahy had taken issue with, perceiving her as being stuck up. They broke into her Kensington home and lay in wait, but this time they were thwarted when the woman unexpectedly returned home with a male companion. This was followed by another failed attempt, with the pair taking advantage of Duffy's wife being away for the weekend. They found a target who lived alone in a flat on Abbey Road, but once again their plans came to naught. The woman got the sense that someone was watching her, and as she turned on the bedside light it illuminated the figure of a small red-haired man with pig-like eyes, standing at the window. As she dashed into the garden, the woman began to scream, frightening the man away, but as he fled, she heard him communicate with a second man. Following these failed attempts, the pair changed tack. Instead of targeting women in their homes, they would scour the streets at night and pick out a lone female. Their first known attack on a 20-year-old au pair on the 10th of June 1982. It was just after midnight when they drove by her as she walked alone on North End Way. Parking the car nearby, they lay in wait, and as the woman drew near, they grabbed her and dragged her onto Hampstead Heath, where both assaulted her in the undergrowth. Leaving their victim alone, the pair returned to the car, with Duffy describing the elation they felt as they drove away, with them discussing committing further attacks. It was during this car ride that Duffy claimed the two men made the pact that they would not turn on each other should one of them be apprehended by the police. A promise which had seen Duffy incarcerated while Mulcahy remained free. 3 months after this attack, in September 1982, the pair would carry out 2 attacks just 6 days apart. The first of these took place at Golders Green, and saw the victim being forced into a vehicle when she tried to fight back. She was driven to a secluded wasteland near to Westbury Copse in West Hampstead and close to the Jubilee line, where the woman was assaulted by both men. Just 6 days later, they set upon a 17-year-old girl, who had a belt placed around her neck as her assailants forced her into an isolated area and assaulted her. By October the 24th, 1982, they had become more confident and had hatched a plan to take a woman hostage. That weekend, with Duffy's wife visiting family, the pair placed a mattress on the floor of his flat in preparation for their intended guest. The pair then cruised around Kilburn until they spotted a favourable target, a young woman leaving a takeaway on Kilburn High Street, carrying a teddy bear at her side. Given they were close to Duffy's flat, she seemed an ideal candidate to be their hostage. As such, they parked the car, donned balaclavas, and waited in the shadows for her to approach. Ambushing the woman, the pair swiftly forced her onto Burton Road and halted her attempts to scream by placing a plaster over her mouth. The taller of the assailants then placed a blade against her throat and chillingly offered her the reassurance, "Don't worry, it's a knife." They proceeded to tell the girl that they only wanted her teddy bear, and with the blade still held to her throat, they made her climb over a nearby wall. At some point, the two men had decided against holding her hostage at Duffy's flat. Instead, they both assaulted her and then fled. Duffy told the court that the change of plan had come about because neither of them was prepared to wait with the victim while the other one collected the car. Driving around in the car had become part of their ritual. They would spend hours roaming the streets in search of their next victim. But the release of the Thriller album by Michael Jackson on November the 30th, 1982, added another layer to this ritual. Duffy told the court that Mulcahy had stolen a cassette of the album. This was recovered from his home in 1999, and the pair would listen to the title track on repeat, its macabre lyrics and infectious beat riling them up as they hunted their prey, with their next known attack taking place on the 26th of March 1983. This time they'd spotted a 29-year-old woman walking home from her job as a manageress of a French restaurant. Two men ambushed her while her back was to them, yet she tried to fight them off, and while Mulcahy attempted to assault her, the woman bit his hand in a frantic attempt to escape. Duffy would recall how the woman's defiance enraged Mulcahy, who proceeded to punch and kick her, and the pair fled as she lay beaten on the ground. The 29-year-old later relayed to the police that her assailants had an almost telepathic means of communication. They barely spoke, with a simple nod or a hand gesture seemingly enough for the other person to understand. While this victim had seen what many would describe as being two bodies with one mind, the pair were not always in agreement, particularly when it came to deciding who would rape the victim first. This decision, Duffy revealed, was made callously by tossing a coin. Once they had determined this, they both knew their roles during the attack, with one of them carrying out an assault, while the other lingered nearby, acting as lookout, and then they would swap places. At the time of their next assault in July 1983, they had begun to hone their strategy. On this occasion, they spotted an art student standing on a station platform in South London at around 11 p.m. She had been making her way to meet her boyfriend when she was stopped by a man asking for the time. Yet, only a few hundred yards further along her route, she was grabbed from behind and felt a cold metal blade against her neck. She was taken at knife point to a desolate stretch of wasteland located beside a railway line. Here she was pushed against the wall of a derelict structure by the taller of the two men. Pinning her arms against the rough brick, he told her, "My name's Dave, and I've never touched a woman before." Despite her fear, the student didn't plead for them to not hurt her. Instead, she tried to talk to her attacker, trying to remain calm. It seemed her strategy was working, as she felt the man loosen his grip. The student saw this as a chance to escape, but he was faster and stronger than her, and now enraged by her actions, he forced her to the ground and violently assaulted her. Following this attack, there was a 6-month lull in their activities, with some reports claiming that this was when Duffy's wife Margaret had left him, while others suggest it was around this time that he had learned he was unable to father children. Whatever the cause, the pair were drawn back to their nocturnal pursuits on the 20th of January 1984. They had spent most of that day helping decorate the home of Mulcahy's parents, but as darkness descended, they got into Mulcahy's car and began to trawl the streets, with Thriller blaring through the speakers. By now, they had established a preference for attacks near train stations, likely knowing that they were to encounter women and girls who were travelling alone, as was the case for the 33-year-old social worker who was making her way to Barnes Common Station. She was knocked to the ground by a punch, and before she could clamber to her feet, a knife appeared at her neck, and a rag was swiftly placed over her mouth to prevent her from screaming. Cautioned they would harm her if she did not comply, the woman was taken to a copse of trees. However, the assault did not go as Mulcahy intended, with the victim later recalling that he failed to become aroused. As had occurred previously, this situation only infuriated him. Aggressively, he ordered his knife-wielding companion to gouge the woman's eyes out. However, it seemed this rush of anger had resolved his failure to become aroused, as he proceeded to rape the 33-year-old, followed by his companion. It was apparent from each attack that Mulcahy's aggression was intensifying, and he seemed to be finding it harder to reach arousal without some form of violence to instigate it. On the 3rd of June 1984, their routine had become established. As with the other attacks, their 23-year-old victim was accosted from behind, and at knife point escorted to a secondary location. In this case, the young woman was taken from the platform at West Hampstead train station and into the deserted waiting room. From there, she was forced to walk along the live railway lines, to a point where a bridge passed over the tracks. Here they ordered her to remove her clothing, and both men assaulted her. After allowing her to redress, the 23-year-old was then ordered to continue walking along the tracks. Fearing the repercussions, she obeyed, making her way along to a point where a road bridge passed over the railway, and the young woman clambered up the embankment. Any relief she had from escaping soon dissipated when a car approached and she realised the occupants were her assailants. It was an encounter Duffy would later recall, stating that Mulcahy had joked about giving her a lift. He would also claim that although he initially felt a sense of euphoria as they drove away, he also alleged he felt guilty because, quote, "the girl actually reminded me of my wife." While most of these assaults had been successful from their perspective, an attempt on the 8th of July 1984 at Highgate West Hill did not go to plan. Having ambushed a 22-year-old woman heading home from a party, she initially fell to the ground in fear. With two men taking advantage of this, they proceeded to drag her across the road towards Highgate Cemetery. Pausing at the entrance, one of the men ran the blade of the knife across her lips, but then the second assailant tried to place tape over her mouth. This prompted her to go from fright to flight mode. Fighting back against the men, she screamed. To regain control of the situation, the man with the knife threatened that if she didn't stay quiet, he would stab her. However, the warning came too late, as her cries for help had already attracted attention. It was now her assailants' turn to be fearful, as they fled from the scene to avoid being caught. But Duffy would recount that once they were back in the car, the pair discussed how attractive the young woman was, with them agreeing that she could have a future in modelling. While this conversation took place, they drove past the spot of the failed assault, elated by the presence of the police vehicles. Just 7 days later, the pair were back on the streets again, driving along Spaniards Road beside Hampstead Heath at around 2:30 in the morning, when they spotted two 18-year-old girls who had been on a night out in the West End, but having missed the last train, they were walking home. These were the two Dutch au pairs. Duffy later acknowledged that he and Mulcahy had initially been apprehensive about targeting two victims at once. They had become comfortable being able to control a single female, not only to keep her compliant, but they also acted as lookout for each other. Two victims increased the risk of losing control of the situation, and they wouldn't have anyone to act as lookout. However, after a brief conversation, they formulated a plan, agreeing that they would each have their own victim. Donning masks and each wielding a weapon, one holding a knife while the other an imitation Colt Python gun, they approached the two teenagers and forced them into a spot where they couldn't be seen from the road. The taller of the two men instructed the pair to be nice to him, before the girls were taken to separate areas where they were assaulted. While the taller man seemed aggressive, the smaller seemed more subdued. He even apologised to the girl following the assault, although this didn't stop him from stealing their money. The clothing retrieved from this attack held the vital DNA evidence which would help police bring charges against Mulcahy. It was also noted that during this attack, Mulcahy had referred to Duffy by his name. Leaving trace evidence and Mulcahy naming Duffy demonstrates the two men hadn't taken as much care as they had done previously, perhaps because it was their first time dealing with two victims at once. However, it seems that for Duffy, having full control of a victim for the first time had ignited his desire to carry out rapes alone. Just 3 months after this assault, police stopped at Talbot Horizon, a vehicle which had been seen close to where some of the rapes had occurred. Yet that wasn't the reason for the stop. Upon searching the car, officers found stolen building materials, for which Duffy and Mulcahy would receive a fine. It was also noted that during the vehicle search, a balaclava had been found, but Mulcahy explained he wore this when he was plastering ceilings. This brush with the law did little to quell their nocturnal pursuits, with the two men finding another victim on the 26th of January 1985, when they targeted the 20-year-old German au pair at Brent Cross. Her attack followed the usual pattern, save for, on this occasion, she was ordered to stay under the road bridge where she had been attacked and count to 100 before she moved. Yet the next assault saw a deviation and a potential discord between the two offenders, with them heading to Hampstead Heath train station at 7 p.m. on the 30th of January 1985. Here they found a 16-year-old leaving the station. Mulcahy, dressed in a tracksuit, swiftly approached her from behind, bumping into the teenager as he passed her. As she stumbled, he turned and clamped his hand over her mouth. That was when another man, shorter in stature, emerged and placed his arm around her waist, pressing the sharp point of a knife into her side. The pair took her onto Hampstead Heath, where Mulcahy proceeded to question how old she was and whether she was a virgin. Once in a secluded location, he assaulted her while Duffy stood watch nearby. This is where the situation deviates, as Mulcahy had become increasingly aggressive during this attack, and for some reason Duffy had found this disconcerting. Fearing his friend was close to escalating beyond rape, he told the court, quote, "I so worried, I went back and told him there was someone, and to run. I actually had to pull him by the collar." Signs of Mulcahy's growing aggression were evident during the attack which took place just 2 days later, near Church Row in Hampstead, during which a 23-year-old au pair was struck several times in the face after screaming until she had gone hoarse. Her assailants left her on the ground, her face bleeding and bruised. A month later, in March 1985, they were in the Swiss Cottage area of London when they spotted a 23-year-old heading to a nearby petrol station to buy cigarettes. Having had a knife placed to her throat, she was punched in the stomach before the taller of the two men tried to take her to a secluded spot. Perceiving his intentions, the woman desperately declared that she had AIDS, hoping it would prevent the attack. And while it didn't seem to deter Mulcahy, Duffy intervened, forcing his companion to leave her alone. Despite Duffy's actions in these incidents, he could also be the aggressor, as was evident during the attack on the legal secretary on North End Way in Hampstead Heath, an assault which had forced her to give up her dream of a career in law. It was during this assault Duffy claimed he suspected her blindfold had slipped, and she had seen his face. In response, he punched the girl to force her to avert her gaze. Not only was the level of violence increasing, but the frequency of their attacks was also escalating. On Saturday, the 13th of July 1985, the pair carried out 3 attacks in one night. The first, close to Great Portland Street Underground Station, when a dancer returning home from a Live Aid concert was assaulted. An hour later, they assaulted a nursery school assistant on Kentish Town Road, and shortly afterwards they claimed their third victim of the night, a 24-year-old secretary on Marston Road. This escalation coincided with the breakdown of Duffy's marriage. His wife had left him, and by the end of August that year, she had started a new relationship. This was a period when Duffy was at his most volatile, and on the 28th of August 1985, he would be arrested for raping his estranged wife and assaulting her and her new partner. However, Duffy was granted bail, and in November 1985, he would carry out his first non-solo attack, targeting a teenage girl as she walked past Copt Hill Sports Centre. And just a month later, he and Mulcahy would escalate their offences to murder. Join me next time as I continue the trial, what Duffy claimed happened during the murders, Mulcahy's defence, and what occurred following the verdict. So in the meantime, keep an eye on those shadows.